It was about 8 o'clock at night. Mark Reynolds, a millionaire, was walking through the busy streets of his city when he saw a familiar face amid the crowds. His heart skipped a beat. There, sitting on the sidewalk amid the hustle and bustle, was a woman hunched over in a torn coat, holding a cardboard sign. The words on the sign were simple but heartbreaking. "Hungry. Please help." But it wasn't the sign that shook Mark to his core. It was the woman holding it that did. His ex-wife, Emma, whom he had divorced 10 years ago in a fit of money. He had never seen her since. Mark was completely stunned when he saw his wife in such a state. It had been 10 years since their bitter divorce, and in all that time he had never thought he would see her like this. Emma, the woman who had once been his partner, his closest confidant, and the love of his life, was now sitting on the street, begging for food. Memories came flooding back. Their passionate love, the early days of their marriage as they built a life together, their laughter, their shared dreams. But those memories were soon overshadowed by the painful years to come. But when Mark mustered up the courage to approach the woman, he found out the truth, which made him cry in front of his wife. In tatters, his wife Emma told him something that rocked his world. "I'm dying, Mark. I have late-stage cancer. The doctors have given me a few months." Mark's heart sank. Suddenly, everything, their history, her wealth, her struggles, seemed trivial. Emma wasn't asking for his pity or help. Mark cried on the spot. He just felt sorry. This story will change the way you think about life. Subscribe to the channel before that happens. Mark and Emma's love story had started out like a dream. They met in college, were drawn to each other almost immediately, as if fate had brought them together. Emma, with her warm heart and gentle soul, was the steady force that kept Mark grounded. He was ambitious and driven, had big dreams of building a business empire, and Emma admired that about him. She saw his potential, believed in him when no one else did, and gave him unwavering support. They were inseparable, each other's biggest cheerleaders, and in the early days of their marriage, it seemed like nothing could tear them apart. They were soulmates, or so it seemed. Life was good for a while. They lived simply, but they were happy. Emma had always envisioned them growing old together, forming a family, and sharing life's simple joys. She didn't need fancy things, she just needed Mark. And in the beginning, Mark felt the same way. They would sit on the balcony of their small apartment, talking for hours about the future they were going to build together. Emma believed in his dreams as if they were her own. But as Mark's business began to grow, so did the demands on her time and energy. What began as long hours turned into late nights, then weekends, and soon Mark began to live for his work. Emma tried to be patient. She loved Mark and knew how much his success meant to her. When he missed dinners or was too tired to talk, she didn't complain. She told herself it was only temporary, that once he achieved his goals, things would be okay, and they would return to the life they had always planned. But as time went on, Mark became more and more distant. The business was flourishing, and with it came wealth, power, and recognition. Mark reveled in the praise and attention, but something inside him changed. He began to see the world through the lens of his success, and the more money he made, the more he wanted. With every new deal, every new client, Mark was becoming further and further away from the man Emma loved. He was immersed in his work, obsessed with growing his empire. He was always on his phone, always in a meeting, always planning the next big move. Emma, who was once his partner in everything, became a shadow in his life, someone who was there with him but no longer really visible. She tried to talk to him to reconnect, but it felt like she was talking to a stranger. The Mark she knew, the one who cherished their quiet moments and dreamed of a future together, was lost in the whirlwind of success. When Emma finally brought up the idea of starting a family, hoping it would bring them together again, Mark dismissed it without a second thought. "It's not time yet, Emma," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "I'm on the verge of something big. We can't afford distractions right now." His words cut her deeper than she realized. For Emma, it wasn't about money or time. It was about the life they had promised each other. But Mark no longer cared about that promise. His empire had become his priority, and Emma's dreams had crumbled to dust. The distance between them grew so much that it became unbearable. Emma felt like she was living with a stranger, someone who no longer valued her or their marriage. She tried to hold herself together, but Mark's ego and obsession with success made it clear that she was no longer part of his world. The marriage, once full of love and hope, fell apart. They argued often. Their relationship broke down. In the end, Mark was just gone. The divorce was cold and impersonal, exactly like Mark had become. Emma walked away with nothing but her dignity, and Mark, caught up in his ego, didn't care. When she walked away from the life they had built together, Emma felt a deep sadness, but also a sense of relief. She had given everything to the man she loved, but in the end, it wasn't enough. Mark, blinded by his ambition, couldn't see that what he had lost was far more valuable than anything his wealth could buy. And while Emma was left with almost nothing, at least she still had herself. Mark, on the other hand, was left with his empire, but a life devoid of love. Seeing Emma so weak and worn out on the sidewalk after 10 years shocked Mark in a way he wasn't prepared for. He hadn't seen her in 10 years, and time had changed them both. But the woman sitting there with her torn coat and cardboard board, begging for help, it didn't seem possible that this was the Emma he had once loved. As he watched her from his car, his mind raced and a storm of emotions surged inside him. First came pity. It was hard to see someone you once knew, someone you had once spent your life with, so low. He felt sorry for her, for the struggles she had faced, and wondered how her life had taken such a drastic turn. How could the vibrant, strong woman he had married end up here, on the streets, asking strangers for help? His heart ached to think of all she must have gone through. But then, along with the pity, something even darker came over him, a disquieting sense of satisfaction. It seemed as if this was some kind of cosmic justice, a strange form of karma that had been fulfilled. In a twisted way, Mark couldn't help but think that Emma's current situation was a result of their past, of the way things had ended. Perhaps, in some part of his mind, he felt he had been proven right. He had worked hard for everything he had achieved, and while there was some emptiness in his life, he was still standing strong. Emma, however, had been broken. It was an uncomfortable thought, but it persisted, making him feel both superior and uneasy at the same time. The longer Mark sat in his car watching her from a distance, the more confused he became. He had everything: money, success, power. But in this moment, it all felt hollow. His wealth had given him control over his world, but it hadn't given him the peace he had hoped for. In fact, seeing Emma shook something deep inside him that he had buried long ago. His life had been based on moving on, forgetting the past. But seeing her now made him realize how much of the past he had never truly let go of. A part of him wanted to walk away, drive off, and leave her there. After all, their story had ended long ago. He had no obligation to her anymore. But another part of him knew he couldn't do that. This wasn't some needy person, this was Emma, the woman who had once stood by him through everything, the woman he had abandoned in his pursuit of success. No matter how hard he tried to convince himself he had made the right choice, seeing her in this state made it impossible to ignore the truth. He hadn't just lost a marriage, he had lost a part of himself in the process. Mark gripped the steering wheel, torn between driving away and facing the feelings he had repressed for so long. He realized that all the money in the world couldn't fix the brokenness inside him. Emma's face, worn and weathered over the years, was a mirror reflecting the emptiness inside him, and that feeling was deeper than any business failure or lost deal. Taking a deep breath, Mark made his decision. He couldn't leave her like that. Not like this. He parked his car on the side of the road, turned off the engine and started walking toward her without knowing why. Every step felt heavy, as if he was carrying the burden of all the years, all the mistakes, all the choices that had brought them to this moment. Mark stood in front of Emma, the woman with whom he had once shared his life, but she did not recognize him at first. Time was cruel, and Emma, who had once been so vibrant and full of life, now looked tired, with marks of hardship on her face. She was hunched over, her eyes tired and dull, as if life had robbed her of even the last ray of hope. As he said her name softly, Emma, there was a glint of recognition in her eyes. She froze for a moment, her eyes lifting to meet his, her face flushed with surprise and embarrassment, as if she had been caught in a moment of weakness. "Mark," she whispered, her voice shaking with disbelief. The tension between them hung heavy in the air, as if a wall of years and regrets were separating them. For a few painful seconds, neither of them spoke. The bustling sounds of the street were slowly fading away, and they were left alone in a silence filled with all the things they had left unsaid. Mark was the first to break the silence. "How are you?" he asked, though the question felt painfully inadequate. It had been 10 years since they had last spoken, and now everything about her had answered that question before she had to answer it. Still, it was all he could think of to say at that moment, his voice uncertain, as if he was searching for some way to connect with the woman he had lost. Emma's face hardened. Behind her eyes was a mix of emotions: shame, resentment, maybe even sadness, but most of all, pride. She was struggling, yes, but she was still Emma. "I'm fine, Mark," she replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, as if she was preparing herself for whatever was to come next. Mark shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to proceed. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her wallet and pulled out several bills and held it out to him. "Here, let me help you," she said, her words well-intentioned but awkward. It was the first thing that came to mind, the offer of money. What else did she have to give? After all, money had become her way of solving problems, of putting things right in her world. But Emma's reaction was immediate. She stiffened, her eyes narrowed as she looked at the money, then back at him. "I don't need your charity, Mark," she said, her voice cold. There was a quiet fury in her words, a sharp reminder that no matter how low she had fallen, her pride was still intact. She was not a problem that could be fixed with a fistful of cash. Mark felt the sting of guilt. He realized too late that his gesture was wrong. It wasn't about the money. It was about the years that had passed, the pain that remained, and the way she had walked out of his life without a second thought. "I didn't mean to," he began, fumbling for the right words, but Emma interrupted him, her expression softening a little as she looked away. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't mean to be angry, it's just hard. You're appearing that way." She glanced down at the signboard in her lap, a symbol of how far she had fallen from the life they'd once shared. Mark could see the weight of everything in her eyes, and for the first time in years, he realized the gravity of what he had left behind. "At least I'll take you to dinner," Mark said, his voice softer now, more genuine. "We don't have to talk about anything if you don't want to. Just a meal." Emma hesitated, her pride clashing with the reality of her hunger and exhaustion. She had every reason to refuse, but something in Mark's tone, something she hadn't heard in years, made her reconsider. Nodding reluctantly, she agreed, though not without looking at him one last time, as if warning him not to try to save her. They walked together, the silence between them deep but not as tense as before. Mark led her to a nearby eatery, a small, quiet place away from the chaos of the street. As they sat across from each other, the past hung between them, unspoken but always present. It wasn't an easy reunion, but it was a beginning, one they both knew would bring about more than just memories. Over dinner, Emma slowly spoke about the last decade of her life. Her voice was soft but steady, and although her face was worn with hardship, there was a quiet strength behind her words that Mark had not expected. She talked about the years after her divorce, how at first she had tried to rebuild her life. Emma had always been resilient, and after the painful end of her marriage, she worked as a school teacher. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her purpose. She loved the children she taught and found a sense of satisfaction in helping others. Her life was simple and modest, but she felt at peace for a while, content with the new path she had created for herself. But then, everything started to unravel. Emma explained that a few years into her teaching career, the school she worked at closed due to budget cuts. She lost her job and with it, the security she had been slowly regaining. Finding new work proved difficult, and her savings, what little she had left after the divorce, began to run out. As time went on, her situation worsened even more. The job market was not favourable, and despite her best efforts, steady work was out of her reach. Then her health began to fail. Emma had always been someone who ignored illness, but this time it was different. Medical bills began to mount, and without insurance, she couldn't afford the care she needed. As her health worsened, so did her ability to work. It was a cruel cycle. No job meant no money meant no healthcare, and without healthcare, she couldn't get back on her feet. The life she had worked so hard to rebuild was slipping through her fingers. Mark listened quietly, his eyes fixed on hers. The guilt that had stirred inside him before was now gnawing at her insides. He had walked away from her, leaving her to pick up the pieces of the life they had once shared. And while he had been earning wealth and success, Emma had suffered hardships. And yet, despite all she had experienced, there was no bitterness in her voice. She didn't blame him for what had happened. Her calm acceptance of her situation troubled him more than any anger or resentment. Emma took a slow breath, looking down at the cup of coffee in her hands. "I thought I lost everything when I lost you," she said, her voice almost like a whisper. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of the past. But looking back, I realized it wasn't me who lost you. It was me. Mark was stunned by her words. He expected anger or remorse, but instead, Emma spoke with an understanding that left him feeling hollow. She had faced life's harshest realities, and instead of falling apart, she had found a way to hold on to something deeper. In the years she spent seeking success, power, and wealth, Emma was fighting for something far more important: her sense of self. "I spent so many years trying to be what you needed, trying to make our lives work," she continued. "But when you left, I had to figure out who I was without you, without the life we'd built together. And that was harder than anything." Mark felt a lump forming in his throat, but he said nothing. He hadn't realized how much of herself Emma had lost during their marriage, how much of her own dreams and identity she had sacrificed to support him. He had always been so focused on his goals, his success, that he hadn't noticed her slipping away. Now, sitting across from her in a cheap diner, he saw Emma in a way he never had before. She was no longer the woman he had left behind, nor the broken figure he had seen on the street. She was stronger than that, stronger than he had ever given her credit for. The realization hit him hard. While he had been measuring his success in dollars and deals, Emma had been measuring hers in survival, in the quiet resilience of someone who had faced life's harshest challenges and come out the other side, still standing. And though her circumstances were dire, she hadn't lost herself. If anything, she had found a part of herself that had been missing all along. For the first time in years, Mark felt something shift inside him, a stirring of emotions he thought he had buried long ago. As they continued to talk, Mark felt an intense desire to help Emma. He couldn't shake the guilt that was weighing on him, and a sense of responsibility filled him. His success, his money, it all seemed so meaningless now. especially in the face of what Emma had endured. He wanted to make everything right. "Emma," he said softly, "let me help you. I can get you settled in a small apartment, help you find a job. I can support you financially. You don't have to struggle like this." For a moment, Emma just stared at him. There was no anger in her eyes, no bitterness, just a deep, familiar sadness. She smiled softly, but it wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the kind of smile that comes from someone who has accepted a harsh truth. "You still don't understand, do you, Mark?" she said, shaking her head quietly. "I don't need your money. I don't need your help." Mark blinked in confusion. "What do you mean? I can fix this. I want to help you." Emma looked down at her hands for a moment, as if gathering the strength to say what she wanted to say next. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but filled with a quiet seriousness that made Mark's heart stop. "I came to this town because I wanted you to find me," she said, her eyes lifting to meet his. "I wanted you to know that not even all the money in the world can buy back what you threw away." Mark felt a knot in his chest. There was something in her voice that unsettled him, something final. "Emma, I don't know," he began, but she interrupted him before he could finish. "I'm dying, Mark," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I have late-stage cancer. The doctors have given me a few months at most." Her words hit Mark like a punch in the stomach. His mind went blank for a moment, as if the world had stopped moving. He stared at her, not fully comprehending what she had just said. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, that can't be true. There has to be something." Emma's eyes softened, and she gave him a sad, gentle smile. "No one can do anything," she said, her voice full of quiet acceptance. "I've made peace with it. I'm not here for your pity, and I'm not here for help. I just wanted to see you again, to make peace with the past." Mark's chest tightened with a mixture of grief and guilt. As her words sank into his mind, his whole world seemed to collapse. He had spent the past decade finding success, amassing wealth, building an empire, but in the end, none of that mattered. All the power, all the money couldn't fix what was truly broken. Emma, the woman he had once loved, was dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop her. He felt deep, painful regret, a kind of sadness he hadn't been able to feel. Suddenly, everything, their history, his possessions, his struggles, seemed insignificant. His money couldn't buy back the time they had lost, couldn't erase the choices he had made. He realized that while he was focused on climbing to the top, he had missed the most important moments, their life together, their love, the future they could have had. And now, it was too late. Emma looked at him with a kind of compassion that made him feel even smaller. "You wanted to fix things with money," she said softly, "but some things can't be fixed. I didn't come here for that. I came because I needed to close this chapter of my life, to forgive you and to forgive myself." Mark's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say, how to respond to the gravity of her words. All the things he had been holding on to, his success, his pride, his belief that he had made the right choices, seemed meaningless now. Emma wasn't asking for anything from him, not his money, not his help. She had come to find peace before she left this world, to help him see the true cost of his choices, not in dollars but in missed moments, in love lost, in a future they never had. Tears welled up in Mark's eyes, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. Powerless to change the past, powerless to save the woman he had once loved, powerless to undo the choices that had led them to this moment. And as Emma sat across from him, calm and accepting of her fate, Mark realized that the only thing left to do was to listen, to be there, and to face the truth he had been running from all these years. Mark was shattered. For the first time in years, he felt something real, something deep. All the success, the money, the power, it all felt empty in the face of Emma's mortality. He had spent years chasing a dream, but in doing so, he had lost the one thing that truly mattered. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emma smiled faintly. "I needed you to see me, not as someone to be fixed, but as someone you once loved. I wanted you to remember that life isn't about the things we collect, but the people we share it with." In the weeks that followed, Mark stayed by Emma's side. He took care of her not out of guilt, but out of love, a love he had buried long ago. They spent time talking about their dreams, their regrets, and the life they could have had. In her final days, Mark realized that all the wealth he had accumulated couldn't buy back time, nor could it fill the void left by Emma's absence in his life. Emma passed away peacefully, knowing that she had made her peace. Mark was left alone not just with his wealth, but with the haunting understanding that life's true riches are found in love, in connection, in the moments we choose to share with others. He had learned too late the true cost of his pride. The story of Mark and Emma delves into the intricate interplay between past choices and the present reality, showing how pride and ambition can shape our futures in ways we never anticipate. Mark, once focused entirely on building his empire and amassing wealth, believed that success would fill every void in his life. But as the story unfolds, the stark contrast between his financial triumphs and the emptiness of his personal life becomes painfully clear. Emma, though left with nothing after their divorce, displays a quiet dignity that stands in sharp contrast to Mark's material success. Despite the hardships she has endured, losing her job, battling health issues, and ultimately living on the streets, Emma's strength lies in her ability to accept her fate without bitterness. She doesn't look for pity or help, but rather seeks closure. Her calm acceptance of her situation reveals that true strength doesn't come from wealth or power, but from resilience and the ability to stay true to oneself. The twist of Emma's illness brings a heart-wrenching shift to the story. The revelation that she is dying introduces a profound sense of mortality, forcing Mark to confront the reality that no amount of money or success can change what really matters. It shatters his perception of control and power, leaving him face to face with the irreversible consequences of his choices. At its core, the story is one of love, regret, and redemption. Mark's emotional journey is a painful one, as he comes to realize that in his pursuit of success, he had lost something far more valuable, Emma and the life they could have shared. Her presence forces him to confront the cost of his pride and ambition, which ultimately robbed him of the things that truly matter: love, connection, and shared moments. Emma's goal wasn't to seek help or salvation from Mark. She simply wanted to help him see the truth, to understand what he had thrown away. In the end, Mark's realization that love and relationships are the true wealth of life leaves him forever changed. The story closes with a powerful message: that real legacy isn't measured by money or status, but by the love we give and the lives we touch.